The market square of Flaxborough was, as a rule, far more talkative during daylight than after dark. By midnight it usually settled into its preferred state, quietly dozing like an elderly relative who refused to go to bed but would not tolerate loud conversation. On this particular night, however, at precisely 12:17 a.m., according to 2 separate mantel clocks and 1 temperamental electric alarm, a sudden voice broke the silence. It was a single voice, cultured, measured, rather too articulate for comfort at that hour. Most curiously, it appeared to be giving instructions. Mrs. Chilby, who lived above the chemist's shop and claimed a sensitivity to disturbances in the moral air, woke with the unmistakable impression that someone outside was calmly asking another person to place the remaining fragment on the spindle. She told her neighbour later that she assumed this must involve some form of midnight engineering or, worse, amateur dramatics. On the other side of the square, Mr. Blount, proprietor of Blount & Sons Gentlemen's Tailoring, though the Sons had moved to Nottingham years ago, heard something entirely different. A man reciting a line that sounded unnervingly like the parliamentary oath. When he peered through his bedroom curtains, he saw nobody at all, only the faint glow of the gas lamp reflecting off the windows of the town museum. Further afield, at the end of Duckmore Lane, young Harriet Pulteney awoke, annoyed because she had been dreaming of a scholarship announcement, and heard, she claimed, a firm male voice dictating recipe ingredients. Her mother insisted this meant nothing. Harriet habitually conflated authority with domesticity. By dawn, Flaxborough had united in one belief. Something had been said in the night, loudly enough to echo, yet softly enough to remain maddeningly ambiguous. What broke the fragile peace further was the discovery that the town museum, a building whose greatest excitement in decades had been the acquisition of a second Edwardian hatpin collection, had not remained as orderly as usual. Mr. Corbally, the museum's curator, entered through the side door at 8:03 a.m. and immediately let out the sort of strangled noise typically produced by an accordion falling down a flight of stairs. This alerted his assistant, who ran in expecting burglars but found instead a scene far too polite for true vandalism. Nothing was smashed, no displays were overturned. The donation box containing a breathtaking 240 remained untouched, but the central display, the Victorian phonograph, had been moved, only by a foot or so, but that was enough for Mr. Corbally to feel faint. The polished brass horn now angled slightly toward the vestibule, not the portrait of Lady Axright, who in life had despised mechanical innovations. More startling still, the wax cylinder on the spindle had been changed. The labelled one, containing a recording of a 1903 mayoral address, notable chiefly for its flatness, had been replaced by a blank. Purbright arrived within the half hour, not because he sensed imminent danger, but because he knew Mr. Corbally was the sort of man who would otherwise require medical supervision by noon. The inspector entered with his habitual calm, offering a polite nod to both curator and assistant. "So," he said gently, examining the phonograph, "the machine has taken a midnight stroll." "It's been interfered with," Mr. Corbally insisted, wringing his hands. "Moved, manoeuvred, disturbed." Purbright leaned closer, prodding the floor with a fingertip. The wooden boards beneath the phonograph glinted faintly. He brushed the surface with a folded handkerchief and found it slick, a patch of floor polished far beyond the rest. "Has this part been recently cleaned?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "Good heavens, no," said Mr. Corbally, affronted by the very idea. Purbright nodded, filing the detail away. He examined the blank cylinder, turning it in his palm. It showed faint finger marks, carefully handled, but not with gloves. "So nothing appears missing?" he asked. "Nothing," the assistant confirmed. But that's the trouble, Inspector. Who breaks in simply to shift one machine and leave everything else? Purbright smiled faintly. Someone with a rather particular purpose. Outside, the town had already begun stitching together theories, a spiritualist experiment gone wrong, a group of students attempting to summon a legendary railway signalman, or, according to Mr. Blount, whose fidelity to the dramatic was occasionally overwhelming, an illicit meeting of masked conspirators practicing ancient parliamentary rituals. As Purbright stepped out into the brightening square, he noted the way people paused mid-stride to whisper how shop doors opened at awkward angles so that proprietors could lean out discreetly. He overheard one woman declare that she recognized the mysterious midnight voice as belonging to the weather forecaster on Midland radio. Another claimed it was identical to the vicar's, though she added she was not implying anything improper. Purbright allowed the chatter to wash over him like gentle rain. In Flaxborough, rumours were often more revealing than facts. He stood for a long moment, looking back toward the museum windows, imagining the brass horn turned slightly askew, the blank cylinder sitting where a different one had been. A foot or so of movement, a polished patch of floor. A voice that woke half the town yet left no footprints. He felt, quietly, privately, that someone had not merely moved an object, but rehearsed something. A test, perhaps, and tests suggested preparation. For what he did not yet know, but the night had spoken, and Purbright, ever patient, intended to listen. By mid-morning, Flaxborough's rumour machinery ran at such a vigorous pace that one could almost hear its gears grinding. The voice at midnight, that brief, cultured fragment which had startled half the town, had already multiplied into at least 9 entirely separate interpretations, each offered with the weary authority of someone who had heard it clearly. Mrs. Chilby, already flushed with moral purpose, declared to anyone passing the chemist's doorway that she had identified the tone as belonging to a man accustomed to issuing commands, naval perhaps, or possibly theatrical. She enlarged this into a theory involving a clandestine rehearsal for a historical pageant, though none had been scheduled. At the grocer's, 2 elderly patrons insisted the voice belonged to a woman, a very tall woman apparently, with excellent projection. They hinted darkly at the existence of a secret spiritualist circle meeting in basements to consult ancestors on pension matters. To bolster the claim, they cited an occurrence from 1949 involving strange tapping noises, though these noises were later attributed to a cat locked in a pantry. Up at the post office, Mr. Reeks, the stationer, was adamant that the voice he heard had been cloaked, a description that suggested considerable emotional influence from his recent reading of Gothic paperbacks. He produced a drawing he'd made, a tall, hooded shape, holding what he described as a ceremonial staff, though closer inspection revealed it resembled the museum's hat stand, hastily sketched. The vicar, Reverend Altwith, shook his head at such embellishments. He had slept through the entire incident and seemed mildly offended by the idea that a dramatic voice should dare echo across the square without ecclesiastical supervision. In the church porch he declared with a certain pointed resignation that the disturbance was quite obviously caused by the youth theatre practising Shakespeare in some unholy hour, adding, "They do like to be inappropriate." At the police station, Sergeant Malley recorded these statements with the pained expression of a man forced to file nonsense under meaningful categories. Even his usual stoicism wavered when Mrs. Bancroft asserted that the voice had been foreign, probably Belgian, and might be connected to a travelling accordionist she once encountered on holiday in Scarborough. Purbright returned from the museum just after 11, having spent the morning moving at his customary pace, unhurried, courteous, and attentive to the smallest quiver of discomfort in those he questioned. He found Mally sorting through a growing pile of witness notes. Most contained overwrought descriptions, but 3 stood out, each from residents who agreed, independently, that the voice sounded familiar, yet none could decide to whom it belonged. "That," Purbright murmured, reading the statements, "is rather interesting." Mally, emboldened by the chance of something tangible, asked, "Shall I organize a voice line-up, sir?" "I suspect it wouldn't help. Familiarity in Flaxborough is often mistaken for resemblance to someone disliked." Purbright did not elaborate, but carried the documents to his office, where he sat for a moment, allowing the overlapping accounts to settle into patterns. The key was that everyone claimed some degree of recognition, yet every claimed identity was different. That suggested not misidentification, but manipulation. Something designed to invoke familiarity without revealing an actual speaker. He thought of the phonograph shifted slightly off-center, the blank cylinder on its spindle, and the curious gleam of the over-polished floor. A recording, played through the horn and carried out of the museum's ventilation grill into the square, could create precisely that effect, a voice recognizable in tone but not in specific character. It would also explain the calm, instructive phrasing several witnesses remembered. He would need more than intuition, though. Flaxborough preferred its truths to be well wrapped in evidence. Before noon he visited Mr. Blount, whose certainty that parliamentary oaths had been recited was, Purbright felt, rooted more in his dramatic nature than in acoustic clarity. Blount received him with sombre gravity, wearing a dressing gown patterned with small sailing ships. "It was unquestionably ceremonial, Inspector," he insisted, offering Purbright a cup of tea, steeped for what felt like geological epochs. "A man does not rise at such an hour simply to instruct others in mundane matters. No, no. This bore the tone of a leader guiding, how shall I put it, a subordinate." "And you saw no one?" "Not a soul, but I sensed authority in the diction." Authority, Purbright reflected, was a quality many in Flaxborough imagined they perceived, usually because they longed to exercise it themselves. Back in the square the whispers swelled. Some now believed the museum had been infiltrated by a secret society. Others insisted a foreign agent had attempted to broadcast encrypted messages to accomplices. The theories grew ever more embellished, like lace on a garment designed to distract from its plainness. Purbright paused near the market fountain, listening without seeming to, his gaze drifting toward the museum facade. The windows reflected the afternoon sun, mild and golden, giving the impression of a building incapable of fostering mischief. Yet someone had been inside. Someone had moved the phonograph by precisely the amount needed to align it with the ventilation grill. Someone had prepared a blank wax cylinder in advance, and someone had engineered a sound designed to seem known yet unplaceable. No vandal would bother with such subtleties. The inspector walked slowly toward the museum once more, not because he expected to find new evidence, but because he wished to view the building from the angle a culprit might choose. When he reached the south wall, he studied the narrow metal vents near the ground. The one corresponding with the phonograph's new position bore faint smudges as if recently handled. A test indeed, he thought. Not destruction, not theft. Something quieter, more controlled. He let the idea settle, turning it over with the care of someone evaluating a chess position. Whoever orchestrated the event wished to know how sound traveled, how clearly it could be heard, and how convincingly it could imitate a human presence. The question then was why. Flaxborough's gossip, for all its chaos, had at least illuminated the town's preoccupations. People heard what they expected to hear: authority, ritual, theatricality, recipes, each interpretation revealing more about the listener than the source. Someone clever could exploit that. Purbright returned to the station with the faintest suggestion of a plan forming. Not yet a solution, but a thread. And in Flaxborough, even the smallest thread, properly teased, could unravel a tapestry of secrets. He sat down at his desk and wrote a single note. The voice was meant to be familiar. Familiarity without identity is deliberate. Then he closed the notebook and allowed himself a quiet breath. The day, it seemed, was only beginning. Purbright returned to the museum that same afternoon, not because he expected chaos, but because Flaxborough's quieter scenes often concealed the most deliberate acts. The building's interior smelled faintly of old varnish and the sort of dust that had settled long before anyone living could remember its source. Mr. Corbally greeted him with a nervous fluttering of hands, as though still afraid the phonograph might make another nocturnal migration, if left unsupervised. "I've checked everything twice, Inspector," he said. "Every label, every catalogue entry, every display case. Nothing is missing, nothing at all." Purbright nodded gently. Nothing missing can be quite as interesting as something taken. This remark unsettled the curator, who looked momentarily betrayed by the laws of logic. He led Purbright to the Victorian Gallery and hovered beside him, wringing his fingers anxiously. The phonograph sat precisely where it had been found that morning, marginally off its usual pedestal position, but now surrounded by ropes and a hand-lettered sign urging visitors to keep a respectful distance. Purbright approached the machine and considered it anew. "You're certain it was properly aligned last evening?" "Quite certain," Corbally replied, indignant. "I positioned it myself. Lady Axright's portrait was to face it during the Council's guided tour next week. Symbolic, you see, her fondness for innovation." Purbright privately doubted Lady Axright had ever been fond of anything resembling a machine, yet he did not challenge the sentiment. Instead, he inspected the pedestal, the polished floorboard beneath it, and the faint, scrape marks that suggested a careful, symmetrical adjustment of position rather than clumsy tampering. "May I see your equipment?" "Log?" he asked. Corbally hurried off and returned with a thick binder filled with precise, obsessively neat handwriting. The page concerning the phonograph was pristine, with no recent amendments. The blank cylinder, now resting on the spindle, had its own entry. An unused recording medium, stored in the basement's archival drawers. "There should be dozens like it," Corbally whispered, "though I haven't checked the drawers today." "Let's do that," Purbright suggested. They descended to the basement, a space with stone walls, cool air, and the muffled calm of a room that had never experienced excitement. Rows of drawers lined the far wall, each containing wax cylinders arranged in careful chronological order. Corbally opened the drawer where blanks were stored and stared with evident relief. "All present," he said. "Unless I'm miscounting. 3 rows of 12, perfectly intact." Purbright counted as well. 3 rows of 12, indeed, 36 cylinders, all unblemished and unused. Yet something caught his eye, a faint indentation in the dust at the front edge of the drawer, as though someone had rested a hand there. It was subtle, easily dismissible as ordinary handling, but the curator's meticulous nature made such marks unlikely. "Has anyone else been down here recently?" Purbright asked. "Only myself," Corbally replied. "And perhaps Mrs. Pulteney, but she only visits when she thinks the exhibits require a moral review." "Did she come yesterday?" Corbally hesitated. "Well, yes, briefly. She claimed one of the Victorian plaster busts was staring too intently at visitors." Purbright allowed the faintest sigh to escape. "I see." Back upstairs, he turned his attention to a narrow corridor behind the main gallery, where a set of old storage crates stood half hidden beneath a dust sheet. Something on the floor caught his eye, a small, curled scrap of paper. He picked it up and saw it was a fragment of a museum label, cream-coloured card with a printed border torn neatly at one edge. Corbally gasped. That must have come from a display item. Oh dear, we must find which one. But Purbright slipped the scrap into an envelope. Let's not alarm ourselves just yet. He surveyed the gallery again, this time with a deeper sense of intrusion. The room's order had not been disrupted, yet its stillness felt strained, as though something had been recently disturbed and then carefully restored. Every exhibit faced forward, untouched. Every cabinet remained neatly sealed. Only the phonograph and that torn label hinted at the faintest ripple in the calm. As he moved through the hallway, he encountered Mrs. Pulteney herself, holding an umbrella despite the afternoon's clear weather. "I've been telling Mr. Corbally," she announced, "that the museum is quite the breeding ground for inappropriate influences. Voices in the night, displaced machinery, it's high time someone took moral ownership." Purbright regarded her with polite interest. "You heard the voice as well?" "Certainly not," she replied, offended. "I was asleep, but I sensed something this morning, a vibration. My mother always said that disturbances of character leave traces." "That seems a generous observation," Purbright murmured. Mrs. Pulteney leaned closer. "And I saw a glint inside just now, a glimmer of brass from the corner of the phonograph, yet I was standing nowhere near it." "Light behaves strangely in these old rooms," Purbright said. She huffed. "Not when brass is involved." After she swept out of the building, Purbright lingered near the phonograph once more. Her remark about brass reflected what he had already noted. The horn's polished surface bore faint smudges, not from fingerprints, but from being gripped at its rim. Someone had repositioned it with care, not merely moved the machine, but adjusted its orientation. He checked behind the pedestal. Nothing else had shifted. No footprints. No dust disturbed except for the polished patch beneath the device, as though someone had deliberately buffed the floor to reduce friction for the movement. This was no impulsive act. It was exact, practiced, calculated. When he finally left the museum, Purbright carried with him three things: the image of a blank cylinder placed with near reverence, the torn label fragment, and the notion strengthening with each passing hour that the midnight voice had been part of a plan not yet fully enacted. The museum, in all its tidy order, had been part of that plan too. And somewhere among its quiet shelves, someone had left a trace intended to be invisible to almost everyone. Almost. By the following morning, the museum's peculiar disturbance had begun to crystallize into a more manageable narrative in the minds of certain townspeople, one that the police station, unfortunately, found impossible to ignore. For once, the gossip aligned with something that resembled logic, or at least Flaxborough's approximation of it. The midnight voice, the slight shifting of the phonograph, the careful handling of the wax cylinder. These were not the actions of an opportunistic intruder, nor the chaotic impulses of a bored teenager. They were, according to Sergeant Malley, best explained by Martin Grieve. Malley brought this theory to Purbright with the earnest pride of someone presenting a well-arranged string of clues that had, in truth, been handed to him by three separate shopkeepers and a retired librarian. "Grieve was at the library that evening, sir," Malley said, standing at attention beside Purbright's desk. "Performing a reading. Dramatic. Voices and all. He's known for mimicry, apparently." "Indeed," Purbright murmured, continuing to read through the statements. "And he was seen walking near the square around 11. Mrs. Bancroft said he had that look in his eye." "Which look might that be?" Artistic, sir." Purbright offered a mild smile. A dangerous condition. Malley ignored the humour and pressed on. Also, and this seems important, he once complained about the museum's phonograph being atrociously maintained. Said it was disrespectful to historical performance. "Ah," Purbright said, closing the file. "So he had both motive and aesthetic grievances." The sergeant nodded with finality, confident he had laid out an unassailable case. But Purbright remained still for a long moment, gaze drifting toward the station window, where a pale winter sun struggled through weak clouds. He tapped his fingers once, lightly, against the desk. "Would you bring Mr. Grieve in for a chat?" he asked, though his tone suggested no great urgency. Malley brightened. "Right away, sir." Martin Grieve arrived an hour later, ushered into the interview room, with the tentative air of a man accustomed to performing on small stages, but unaccustomed to real judgment. He was slender, with a soft voice and eyes that seemed permanently unsure whether to meet a person's gaze or politely retreat from it. He carried a small satchel, which he clutched as though it contained either valuable papers or an emergency exit. "Mr. Grieve," Purbright greeted him warmly, offering tea. "I appreciate you coming in." Grieve accepted the cup with both hands as though fearing it might escape. Sergeant Malley said this was, well, not serious, but something requiring clarification. "I must say, Inspector, I'm rather horrified that I might be connected to anything disruptive. I dislike disturbances. They unsettle people." "Quite understandable. We simply want to discuss the events of the night." Grieve managed a nod, but looked as though he would rather face an audience of 500 than 2 policemen. "I went home from the library at about 11:15, he said. "I remember the time because I checked my watch and found it had stopped again. It always stops when it's cold." "And you walked through the square?" "Yes, but I didn't see anyone else or hear anything unusual." Purbright gently turned the conversation. "You're known for your vocal range, I believe?" Grieve grimaced, embarrassed. "I dabble in readings for the library volunteers, old letters, historical notes, nothing dramatic, truly. People exaggerate." "Some heard a voice last night," Purbright said calmly. "A cultured voice, measured? It reminded a few listeners of yourself?" This seemed to appall Grieve more than any accusation of criminal intent. "Inspector, I would never go about shouting in the street at such an hour. It is entirely against my nature. I speak quietly always. Projection is, well, rather beyond me unless encouraged by a script." Malley frowned, but Purbright merely watched Grieve's mannerisms. His hands trembled slightly, but the trembling was not guilt, rather a deep discomfort at the idea of causing public disruption. His voice lacked the resonance required to fill a square, even with determination. More importantly, his nature lacked the confidence needed to perform such a precise maneuver as repositioning a phonograph, aligning it with a ventilation grill, and executing an experimental sound test. "Have you visited the museum lately?" Purbright asked. "Oh, yes," Grieve said, brightening. "Last week. Their Victorian collection is quite admirable, but I've no reason to go there at night. I assure you I was home and asleep before midnight." Purbright nodded, satisfied not by the words, but by the way they were delivered. Hesitant, earnest, incapable of deception, without tacking on 5 unnecessary qualifiers. Even his anxiety seemed too unpolished to hide a secret purpose. After Grieve was gently dismissed, Malley remained unconvinced. "He fits, sir. The voice, the proximity, the interest in the phonograph." "Yes," Purbright agreed mildly. "He fits. But so does a coat on a peg if you press it firmly enough." Malley frowned, unsure whether this was a rebuke. Purbright stepped out into the corridor, letting the museum fragments drift through his mind, the polished floor, the blank cylinder, the torn label hidden behind crates. None felt like the work of an impulsive actor. Actors sought audiences, applause, recognition. The midnight voice had offered none of these, only a brief, functional utterance, delivered with the exact neutrality of a machine. It was not a performer's flourish, it was a test. As he returned to his office, Purbright paused by the evidence tray where the torn label fragment rested in its envelope. A clean, deliberate tear. Labels rarely fell apart on their own. Someone had removed it neatly, quietly, with intent. Martin Grieve was many things. Timid, thoughtful, occasionally theatrical, but he was not a man of neat, quiet precision. The inspector sat back in his chair, feeling the investigation shift imperceptibly toward a broader landscape. The plausible suspect, so tidy, so convenient, was rarely the true answer in Flaxborough. People here hid things not out of flamboyance, but out of remarkably ordinary human motives. And someone, somewhere, was hiding something now. The dismissal of Martin Grieve, both polite and quietly decisive, left Purbright with the familiar sense that the investigation had merely been circling its true starting point. Convenience had offered a suspect, instinct had declined him, and now it was the subtler threads, the ones less likely to be seized upon by Malley or by Flaxborough, at large, that required examination. He returned once more to the museum early that afternoon, finding it emptier than usual. A pair of tourists from Lincoln eyed the Edwardian hatpins without much comprehension, while Mr. Corbally occupied himself in the corner with a feather duster and the tension of a man who feared dust might form out of spite. Purbright moved past him toward the phonograph display. The machine sat in its newly cordoned-off space, silent, innocuous, and yet very much the center of attention. But the inspector's focus was not the machine itself. It was the floor beneath it. The polished patch retained its faint gleam, a small but unmistakable betrayal of recent, deliberate movement. Purbright crouched, a gesture that caused Corbally to gasp softly, as though crouching in a museum were akin to desecration. "Inspector, you surely don't think there was dragging?" Purbright examined the straight line of sheen extending only an inch or so from the pedestal. "Not dragging, sliding," he corrected gently. "Sliding requires intention, and a smooth path." He traced the direction of the polished streak with his eyes. It aligned perfectly with the ventilation grill on the far wall, the same grill he had inspected the previous morning, from the outside. "A curious thing," he murmured. Corbally leaned forward with visible anxiety. Curious in a dangerous way or a historical way? "Historical, I suspect," Purbright said, partly to calm him. He stood and followed the trajectory again, this time taking slow, careful steps across the room. The alignment was precise, too precise to be accidental. Whoever had moved the phonograph had known exactly where to place it. This was not experimentation made in haste, it was preparation carried out with quiet certainty. And then he remembered Mrs. Pulteney's comment, her melodramatic insistence that she had seen a glint of brass from the gallery corner. That detail, which he had dismissed as either imagination or the result of sunlight hitting a reflective surface, now pressed with new significance. He walked to the corner where she claimed to have stood. From that angle, the brass horn of the phonograph would not naturally catch the light, unless it had been angled differently at the time. The horn had likely been turned again, after the test. Purbright stood very still, letting that settle. He turned slowly, scanning the room with the eye of someone trying to recall not what had been disturbed, but what had been moved back. The torn museum label he'd discovered behind the crates came to mind, its absence still unexplained. He found himself drawn, almost involuntarily, toward the series of plinths displaying small Victorian curios, letter openers, calling card cases, miniature portrait frames. And there, behind the largest plinth, something caught his eye again, another faint scrape mark, shaped slightly differently from the first, but similarly telling. He stepped behind the plinth and examined the baseboard, a second patch of polished wood, shorter, narrower, but unmistakably new. He bent closer. "This is not from the phonograph," he said quietly. Corberley had followed at an anxious distance. "Another disturbance, Inspector?" "Yes, though smaller in scale." He opened a nearby cabinet, not expecting to find anything missing but curious nonetheless. The objects were arranged in their meticulous order. He checked the inventory sheet fixed to the inside of the glass. Every item was accounted for. But when he reached the display of miniature portrait frames, he paused. One of them, the smallest, displaying an unremarkable sepia photograph of an unknown Victorian gentleman, sat slightly closer to the edge of the shelf than its companions. Barely a fraction of an inch, no more, but the shift was unmistakable to a practiced eye. "Has this cabinet been cleaned recently?" he asked. "Oh yes," Corberley said. "Mrs. Ransom, our volunteer, polished them yesterday afternoon. She is very methodical." Purbright tapped the glass lightly. "Methodical people don't leave things asymmetrical." The curator's eyes widened. "Do you think someone touched it? Moved it?" "Someone moved something," Purbright said. "But not for theft. For inspection, perhaps." He stepped back, replaying the mental map, the polished floor by the phonograph, the scrape behind the plinth, the displaced frame, the torn label. A pattern was beginning to form, faint but steady. Something had been studied, examined, tested, and the midnight voice, so abrupt and fleeting, no longer seemed like the primary act. It felt like the consequence of preparation, a rehearsal for something else. He returned to the phonograph one more time, lifting the blank wax cylinder to eye level. It showed no engraving, no scratch indicative of playback. Whoever had used it had done so briefly, perhaps even only to check alignment. The true cylinder, the one that mattered, had been the one removed. "Mr. Corberley," Purbright said, "did the museum ever acquire any cylinders that were not catalogued? Private donations, perhaps? Items offered informally?" Corberley blinked. "Well, occasionally people bring in old boxes, things from attics, but we only catalogue those with verifiable provenance." "And the others?" "They are placed aside, usually in storage. Some are returned, some kept. But nothing unlabeled is ever displayed." Purbright nodded slowly. "And are the unlabeled pieces kept together?" "Yes, in the second basement drawer. But I assure you, Inspector, those have not been touched in months." Purbright did not argue. He simply took in the curator's nervous certainty, the museum's deceptive stillness, and the faint traces of careful movement concealed beneath it. The oddest little detail was no longer the polished patch on the floor. It was that someone had taken great care to disturb almost nothing, yet left behind signs of precise, deliberate adjustments. The museum had not been vandalized, it had been studied. The museum, with its polished traces and minute disturbances, had revealed enough to confirm that the investigation was no longer contained within its walls. Whoever had entered the building that night had not done so out of curiosity or mischief. They had acted with purposeful delicacy, shifting objects only by inches, creating no chaos, leaving no bold signature. That kind of restraint belonged to someone who knew precisely what they were seeking, and why. Flaxborough, naturally, had already formed its own parallel inquiry. Purbright found the townspeople's theories proliferating like ivy, clinging to surfaces, growing in unplanned directions, and occasionally blocking the light for everyone else. At the tea counter in the market hall, Mrs. Sims declared confidently that the museum incident was the work of Jonah Root, the antique dealer with a reputation for liberating items that, in his poetic phrasing, were yearning for a more appreciative home. Her justification was that he had once offered to buy the phonograph outright, only to be rebuffed by Corbally with a firmness that had left Jonah nursing a lifelong aesthetic injury. Jonah himself, when Purbright stopped by his cramped shop, greeted him with the aggrieved dignity of a man accustomed to defending his moral fibre on a weekly basis. "I value history, Inspector," he insisted, standing amid shelves of objects that looked like they might have been gathered from every attic in the county. "But I would never break into a museum, not even to rescue an artifact from curatorial neglect, tempting though it may be." Purbright regarded him with polite interest. "You visited the museum recently?" "Yesterday afternoon," Jonah admitted. "I go often to check for undervalued treasures, strictly above board, of course. Did you notice anything unusual?" Here Jonah paused, uncertain whether admitting curiosity might implicate him. Only that Corbally seemed even more jumpy than usual, kept muttering about visitors touching things. "And you?" "I touched nothing except a walking stick display, and only because one of them looked like it wanted to fall." Purbright left the shop, with the sense that Jonah Root's vanity far outweighed his subtlety. A man so fond of performance would not execute the phantom precision required to slide a phonograph across the floor without drawing attention. Next on the inspector's path was Dr. Sybil Harbury, a retired psychologist who lived in a comfortably untidy cottage near the river and possessed an unwavering belief that museums were emotional hazards waiting to happen. She had once led a campaign to have the Victorian wing closed on the grounds that it romanticized oppressive eras, an initiative politely ignored by nearly everyone. Dr. Harbury welcomed Purbright with a cup of herbal tea that smelled strongly of boiled twigs and something medicinally resentful. "You must tell the council," she insisted before he had even sat down, "that the museum invites psychological disturbances. Old objects carry unresolved energies. People underestimate resonance." "Do they?" Purbright asked, sipping the tea with care. "Certainly. Voices, echoes, impressions, none of them surprising. I'm only amazed it took this long for something to manifest." Purbright doubted the museum's midnight voice had been a manifestation of psychic turbulence, but he asked nonetheless, "Were you near the square that night?" "Good heavens, no, I was indoors reading, but I felt unrest in the morning, a weight in the air, perhaps a collective reaction." Purbright thanked her and left before she could prescribe lavender compresses for the constabulary. Her disdain for the museum was genuine, but her fears were rooted in ideology, not in the meticulous manipulation of wax cylinders or ventilation acoustics. Osric Bell, however, was different. Osric was a night watch volunteer, a man who took his self-appointed duties more seriously than most took paid employment. He wore a reflective vest even at times of day when sunlight posed no danger, and frequently patrolled the square to deter nocturnal misdemeanors, a phrase he pronounced with relish. Purbright found him outside the town hall, fiddling with a torch whose beam flickered at irregular intervals. "You were on duty the night of the disturbance," Purbright said pleasantly. "I was patrolling," Osric corrected, as though on duty implied official recognition he had not yet been granted. "I covered the square at 11, then Duckmore Lane shortly after, then circled back again at, let me think, around 1:45. Did you see anyone in the square?" "No one." "You're certain?" Osric hesitated, just long enough to be notable. "Quite certain." Purbright watched the man's jaw tighten. That slight pause meant something. Not guilt, perhaps, but the pressure of memory meeting self-protection. Osric liked to imagine himself the silent sentinel of the town. Admitting that something occurred during his watch would dent the armor of his self-regard. "And you didn't hear anything?" Purbright asked gently. Osric's grip on the torch tightened. "Only the wind, and perhaps a cat." "A cat with unusually articulate phrasing?" Osric flushed. "People exaggerate." Purbright thanked him and moved on, but not before noting Osric's restless gaze drifting repeatedly toward the museum, as though weighing how much he did, or did not, wish to admit. By late afternoon, Purbright had gathered a mosaic of personalities: Jonah Root with his acquisitive eye, Dr. Harbury with her psychological anxieties, Osric Bell with his self-appointed guardianship, Mrs. Pulteney with her moral vigilance. Each had wool-thread motives and fragmentary associations with the museum, none yet strong enough to anchor the culprit, but collectively they revealed the currents beneath Flaxborough's calm surface. Small grievances, quiet ambitions, private discomforts, and something deeper still. The sense that the museum and its contents held significance to more people than one might expect. Purbright walked back through the square, listening as snippets of conversation floated from open shop doors. Theories, confessions, fear disguised as certainty. The deeper the gossip spread, the more careful the truth became. He paused beneath the museum window, glancing at the grille just visible through the ironwork. Someone had tested the projection of a voice. Someone had aligned the phonograph with exacting care. Someone had moved objects so gently that only a polished streak and a displaced frame betrayed their intent. Someone had planned, and Purbright, with a quiet certainty of his own, felt the next piece of the puzzle approaching, not loudly, but like a faint footstep in an otherwise empty corridor. Something else would happen. He could feel it. It came, inevitably, in the kind of quiet hour Flaxborough preferred for its small upheavals. Late evening, not yet dark enough for mystery, not quite light enough for reassurance. Purbright had just finished reviewing the day's accumulation of statements when the telephone rang with the urgent tremor of a man unused to urgency. It was Mr. Corberley. "Inspector, it's happened again." Purbright arrived at the museum within 10 minutes, though one would not have guessed it from his composed step. Corberley met him at the door, hair unsettled and waistcoat even more askew than usual. "It's the basement," he whispered, as though the walls might overhear. "The door, it was open." "Unlocked?" Purbright asked. "Open," Corberley stressed, "as in I found it ajar, just an inch, but the key hasn't left my ring." He held up the key ring, hands trembling. Purbright inspected it briefly, not because he doubted Corberley's claim, but because details mattered, especially when panic warped memory. "Show me," he said. They descended the staircase. The basement door, thick oak reinforced with iron bands, hung slightly open. Its hinges emitted a weary creak as Purbright pushed it. Inside, the air felt disturbed, not violently, but rearranged like a room someone had walked through with deliberate, cautious steps. Purbright's gaze moved across the shelves. Dust patterns were subtly shifted. A book on Edwardian funerary customs sat half an inch out of alignment. A crate lid rested ajar, though its contents appeared undisturbed, but the most striking difference was on the far wall. The shelf of wax cylinders, those meticulously arranged by date and subject, looked wrong, not ransacked, not plundered, rearranged, not randomly but with peculiar care. Cylinders from the bottom row now sat on the top, some from the top moved downward, and a gap, small but unmistakable, rested at the end of the third row. A single cylinder, missing. Purbright stepped closer. Corbally behind him emitted a noise somewhere between a gasp and a whimper. "I never touched that shelf," he said. "Never. It's strictly archival. Nobody is permitted." "Someone was permitted by themselves," Purbright murmured. "And permitted by opportunity?" He lifted a displaced cylinder, rolling it gently between his palms. There was a faint ridge of dust on one side, as though it had been tipped slightly before being reshelved. "Do you keep a list of these?" he asked. "Of course," Corbally replied, already scrambling for the index book kept in a desk drawer. His page flipping grew more frantic as he matched catalogue numbers with the newly disordered rows. Purbright let him work, instead turning toward the smaller basement window, a square aperture high on the wall, half covered by ivy from the outside. He examined the sill, dust disturbed, a faint scrape, and something else, a tiny sliver of dried leaf clinging to the frame. "Mr. Corbally," he called softly, "this window has no alarm." "Only the main doors are alarmed," Corbally said, peering at the window with growing horror. "But nobody could fit through. Well, perhaps someone slight. Perhaps slim shoulders, perhaps, and patient hands." Purbright ran his fingers lightly across the sill. "Someone who preferred not to use doors." The window latch, old and rusted, had been lifted with careful force. "Not broken," persuaded. Corbally swallowed. "One cylinder missing. Just one. I've checked the numbers. The gap should contain a wax recording from 1902, a private donation. The donor never supplied details. It was part of an attic clearance." "Have you ever played it?" Purbright asked. "No, the condition seemed too fragile and there was no identifying label. I thought it best to leave it undisturbed until properly restored." Someone else disagreed. Purbright returned to the cylinder shelf, studying the pattern of rearrangement. Whoever had done this wasn't searching through everything. They had known precisely where their target lay. They had moved surrounding cylinders not in haste, but with the quiet accuracy of someone careful not to leave chaos behind. This was not theft in the usual sense. It was recovery, removal, extraction. He checked again the ventilation grill outside the room. A faint draft pushed inward. The grill was old, secured by aged screws. And there, in the corner of the mesh, a smear that could have been brushed off a sleeve or gloves. The curator's voice shook. "Inspector, I don't understand. Why one cylinder? Why an unlabeled one? There are far more valuable items down here." Purbright did not answer immediately. He pictured the phonograph in the gallery, moved with exacting precision. The blank cylinder placed on its spindle. The midnight voice drifting across the square. And now this, a second entry, not to shift a machine but to remove something from the museum's quiet archive. "Someone has been preparing," he said quietly. "First, by testing sound. Now by retrieving a recording." "But what recording?" Corbally asked. "It could be anything. A family message, a song, a speech, even a child's babbling." "People rarely take such risks for trivialities," Purbright replied. As they ascended the stairs, Purbright paused in the corridor outside the basement door. He pressed a hand softly to the surface. It did not yield. The wood was thick, the lock old but firm. And yet someone had not used it. Someone had preferred a window 11 inches high. He made a note of the time on his pocketbook. Second incident. No vandalism. Extraction through basement window. Cylinder missing. Intruder prepared. Outside in the square, the night breeze nudged a drift of leaves across the cobblestones. Flaxborough's windows glowed softly, unaware. But Purbright's gaze drifted from the museum toward the narrow alleys branching off Duckmore Lane, the paths someone nimble could slip through unseen. Someone had returned, someone familiar with the museum's weak points, someone confident enough to move without noise or panic, someone pursuing something with steady purpose. The first incident had been rehearsal, the second was execution. And Purbright felt with quiet certainty that the third, whatever shape it took, would not wait long. The walk back from the museum to the station allowed Purbright the kind of reflective quiet he valued most. The night air, cool without bitterness, carried only the faintest noises, a distant dog, a closing shop shutter, the low hum of a street lamp protesting its existence. Flaxborough at such hours revealed its subtleties more willingly. People talked less, buildings held their breath, and the spaces between sounds, those mattered most of all. He paused halfway across the square and looked back toward the museum. Even from this distance, the building seemed to wear its unease discreetly, like a hostess trying not to reveal that something essential had gone missing from the silver cabinet. A single cylinder removed, an unlabeled one, no less. To most, it would appear insignificant, but someone had known what they were taking. Someone had risked discovery, twice, not for theft of value, but theft of meaning. Purbright resumed walking, hands clasped behind his back, letting the puzzle shift gently inside his thoughts. Human motives rarely broadcast themselves. They leaked through behavior, tone, hesitation, the fleeting glance that contradicted the spoken word. The intruder's actions displayed none of the impulsive urges that drove petty crime. This was deliberation disguised beneath layers of calm intrusion. At the station he found Mally reviewing the day's logs with the frown of a man certain the world should make more sense than it currently did. The sergeant looked up eagerly. "Another incident, sir?" "Yes," Purbright said mildly. "A continuation rather than a new beginning?" Mally straightened. "Anything taken this time?" "One wax cylinder." "Just one?" Mally blinked, as though single items offended protocol. "Not the phonograph?" "No." "Not the donation box?" "No." Mally scratched his head. "Who breaks in twice and only steals one cylinder thing?" "Someone who had very particular business," Purbright answered, "and very little interest in disorder." He dismissed Mally with a gentle word and withdrew to his office. He did not switch on the overhead light. Instead, he lit the small desk lamp, allowing the room's corners to remain comfortably obscure. He spread his notebook before him, reviewing each small, accumulating detail: the polished floor, the brief voice across the square, the altered display frame, the torn label, the rearranged cylinders, the basement window latch lifted with patient fingers. Patterns emerged, but not as lines, more as echoes. The midnight voice troubled him most, not because it was mysterious, but because it had been crafted to seem familiar without belonging to anyone. A voice that felt as if it ought to be known, yet could not be placed, was not the hallmark of human vocal performance. It was the hallmark of a recorded voice, perhaps a voice altered slightly by the acoustics of the phonograph horn and the museum ventilation. Someone had tested the projection, wanted to know how a voice would travel, wanted to know if it could be heard distinctly, but not distinctly enough to identify. That test suggested intent to use such a projection again. He leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers. Human nature tended toward three impulses: to hide, to claim, or to confess. Most crimes involved the first or second. This one, quiet, rehearsed, leaned toward hiding, but with an unusual delicacy, not hiding an object, but hiding a truth. The missing cylinder was the key, an unlabeled artifact from a private attic clearance, unplayed, unexamined, ignored by the curator. Who would know it existed? Only someone connected to its donor, or someone who had once visited the museum's storage, or someone who had been searching for such a recording long before the museum acquired it. Purbright opened the inventory list again. The donor's name, Henley Bragg, was scribbled in small ink at the margin, hardly noticeable: deceased, estate cleared, items donated without ceremony. Purbright remembered the name vaguely. Henley Bragg had been a quiet man, retired railway clerk, known mainly for his punctual appearances at the post office. No wife, a distant nephew, a modest house on Fenton Rise, nothing suggestive of scandal, and yet someone had known to search for his cylinder. He closed the book. The motive might not lie in what Bragg had done, but in what he had recorded. People stored odd things on wax cylinders: confessions, private messages, amateur monologues, songs meant for no audience, or remarks intended to be heard by only one person, eventually. What mattered was not the content itself, but the fear someone attached to it. Fear was a powerful curator. He allowed his thoughts to drift back through the procession of people he'd spoken with: Jonah Root, with his acquisitive eye; Dr. Harbury, with her anxieties about memory; Osric Bell, who had skipped over his own presence near the square with suspicious haste; Mrs. Pulteney, whose zeal for propriety masked a deep nosiness; the tourists, the grocers, the gossiping locals, all contributing to the fog of talk that might conceal the one person who needed concealment most. Human nature disliked exposure. He stood and moved to the window, looking down at the square. Lamps flickered. A few stragglers ambled past, wrapped in coats. Nothing outwardly unusual existed, and yet someone among them, perhaps someone he had already spoken to, had approached the museum window, lifted the latch, squeezed through a space barely wider than a suitcase, and selected a cylinder from dozens with perfect confidence. The kind of confidence that came from familiarity. He turned back to his desk and made a small note in tidy handwriting. The intruder is not discovering, only retrieving. Another line followed. Familiarity without identity applies to the voice and to the culprit. He tapped the pencil once, lightly, against the page. He thought of the midnight voice again. The calm, instructive phrasing, the lack of emotion, the absence of personality. A voice meant to sound human, but not like a particular human. A voice that would seem known. A voice that would soothe those who feared who it might belong to. A voice meant to act as disguise, not expression. Purbright closed the notebook gently. What troubled him was not the recording itself, nor the intruder's stealth. It was the fact that someone had gone to such elaborate lengths to hide a voice from the past. People rarely feared objects. They feared what the objects revealed. Someone was desperate to reclaim a piece of their own history, and perhaps to silence it forever. And Purbright suspected that once the cylinder was played, somewhere, quietly, privately, the true shape of this case would become audible at last. Purbright woke early the next morning, not out of urgency, but out of a calm certainty that the investigation had reached the stage where people, rather than clues, needed observing. Physical evidence had said all it intended to say. Something had been taken, something had been tested, and someone had moved in the museum with a quiet familiarity few possessed. The next step required human behavior, its hesitations, its glances, its betrayals. He spent the first hour drafting a series of polite invitations on thin, cream-colored stationery. They were written in his neat, unhurried hand, requesting the presence of several townspeople at a small, informal heritage appreciation meeting in the museum's reading alcove. The phrasing was so gentle, so thoroughly non-confrontational, that no one could reasonably refuse. It would seem, to any recipient, more like a tedious civic courtesy than a police matter. By noon, the invited guests began arriving. Jonah Root, carrying an air of injury as though summoned for appraisal rather than conversation. Dr. Harbury, clutching a notebook filled with psychological theories that threatened to bloom at any moment. Mrs. Pulteney, primly dressed, umbrella in hand, prepared to judge the moral tone of the gathering. Osric Bell, stiff-backed, defensive already, and a few others who had wandered too close to the whispering radius of the case. Purbright greeted each person warmly, ushering them toward the semicircle of chairs arranged near the back of the museum. The phonograph sat in its usual position, restored to exact alignment. No one gave it more than a passing glance, except Osric, whose eyes flickered toward it with something like recognition or unease. When everyone was seated, Purbright stood near the corner table, upon which lay a modest spread of objects, a stack of duplicate museum labels, several pencils, and a selection of ordinary documents meant to appear relevant. The torn label fragment, the real center of his interest, rested in his pocket, its edges carefully preserved. "Thank you all for coming," he said in a tone so mild it encouraged relaxation. "The museum is preparing a revised catalogue. Your help in identifying handwriting styles may prove invaluable." This statement was met with polite bafflement. Jonah frowned as though handwriting were an affront to his profession. Dr. Harbury looked as though she planned to interpret the exercise psychoanalytically. Mrs. Pulteney straightened with the earnest self-importance of someone who believed her penmanship to be morally superior. Osric, however, shifted slightly in his chair. Purbright distributed identical sheets to each person. "If you would simply copy the printed text at the top," he said, "we can compare the samples to older museum labels whose authorship is unclear." It was an absurdly benign request. No one could object. They each took pencils and began writing, the room filled with the soft scrapes of graphite on paper. Purbright walked among them without haste, observing the tilt of heads, the pressure of strokes, the small tells that accompanied any exercise requiring honesty. What he watched for was not the handwriting itself, but the reactions. Most people complied with mild curiosity. Dr. Harbury half smiled at her own flourishes. Mrs. Pulteney wrote with fastidious restraint. Jonah scribbled with a kind of impatient impatience, his letters slanted and abrupt. But Osric Bell gripped the pencil with almost painful rigidity, his hand tense, his jaw working as though resisting some internal strain. He wrote the line neatly enough, but when Purbright passed behind him, he saw Osric glance quickly, furtively, toward the corner of the phonograph display. Not for the first time, not in the way of someone admiring a Victorian artifact, in the way of someone checking whether a secret remained hidden. Purbright let the moment settle, then returned to the table, where he made a show of sorting through the collected sheets. He took his time. He hummed faintly, as though weighing the curvature of letters. The tension in the room thickened, not with fear, but with expectation. People waiting to be told something vaguely academic about their handwriting. He let them wait. At last, he lifted one particular sheet, the one written by Osric, and held it gently. "Curious?" he said, only softly. A ripple moved through the group. People leaned slightly forward, eager for any scrap of intrigue. Osric sat very still. Purbright placed the sheet on the table, not among the others, but off to one side. Then, with quiet deliberation, he reached into his pocket and withdrew the torn label fragment. The small rectangle of cream card, so harmless in appearance, drew immediate attention. Jonah blinked at it, confused. Mrs. Pulteney squinted. Dr. Harbury pursed her lips, about to offer an opinion. But it was Osric's reaction that mattered, a barely perceptible tightening of the shoulders, followed by a swift attempt to look deliberately bored. Purbright watched only him. He held the torn label delicately. "This," he said, "was found behind a plinth in the Victorian Gallery, torn from a larger label, likely removed to conceal the movement of an object, not theft, merely repositioning. Osric's jaw tightened. Purbright continued softly. The handwriting on the original label would, of course, tell us a good deal about who handled it last. A pause, a long, careful pause. Then he set down the torn fragment next to Osric's handwriting sample. No comparison was necessary, not yet. The gesture was theatrical only in its precision, a quiet arrow shot with no need to strike loudly. Osric swallowed. Purbright finally turned his gaze toward him, not accusing, not stern, merely inquisitive. "Mr. Bell," he asked, in a tone of almost maddening gentleness, "when you last walked your night watch route, did you visit the museum grounds for any reason other than patrol?" The question, phrased so politely, struck with the inevitability of truth. Osric hesitated. A beat too long. Then another. "I passed by," he said softly. "Just passed by." Purbright nodded. "Of course. And did you notice anything unusual inside?" "No. Not the movement of the phonograph. Not a figure near the window." Osric shook his head, but his eyes darted once more toward the phonograph horn. Purbright's voice dropped, almost kindly. "Mr. Bell, the person who entered the museum knew exactly where to find a particular cylinder. They handled it with care. They left almost no trace. That is not the work of someone unfamiliar with its layout." A hush spread through the room. Even Jonah forgot to look offended. Purbright stepped closer, his tone still low, still polite, but edged with unmistakable precision. "Is there something you wish to tell us, Mr. Bell?" And that was when Osric flinched, so small a movement it might have escaped anyone else. But not Purbright. The trap had been set. And it had caught exactly the tension he expected. For a moment after Osric's small, involuntary flinch, the room held its breath. Everyone seemed to sense that something subtle yet decisive had shifted, like the quiet click of a well-oiled mechanism finally falling into place. Purbright did not press immediately. He let the silence settle, giving Osric room either to speak or to retreat. Human nature often revealed itself most clearly in those few seconds when panic and calculation collided. Osric chose neither. Instead, he closed his eyes briefly, as though steadying himself against a truth long delayed. "I didn't steal anything," he said at last. Purbright nodded gently. "No, I don't believe you did." Osric opened his eyes, startled. The others looked equally confused. It was Mrs. Pulteney, naturally, who broke the stillness first. "But, Inspector," she said, stiff with righteousness, "you implied—" "I implied," Purbright corrected softly, "that Mr. Bell was near the museum at the time of the first incident, that he knew its layout well enough to notice what others would not. That is quite different from theft." Osric swallowed. I wasn't inside." "No," Purbright said, "you weren't." This only muddled the gathered spectators further, which seemed to suit the inspector well. He moved toward the phonograph, stopping beside the polished pedestal. "What occurred that night," he began, "was not a burglary, it was not vandalism, and it was not performance. It was a test of acoustics, of projection, of how sound could be directed through the ventilation grill." Mrs. Pulteney's umbrella wavered. Jonah Root frowned as though someone had mispriced a valuable curio. "A test?" Dr. Harbury asked, intrigued. Purbright touched the rim of the phonograph horn lightly. "A recording was played through this horn and into the square, a brief one. A single line or phrase, calm, measured, authoritative. A voice meant to sound familiar but never identifiable, a voice crafted to drift, not to declare." "But why?" Jonah demanded. "Why do any of that?" Purbright turned slightly, scanning the semicircle of uneasy faces. His gaze rested last on Osric. To see if it could still be heard, Purbright said, to see how clearly a voice from a century-old recording would carry into open air, to know whether words long buried could still find ears. No one spoke. The intruder on the second night, he continued, used the basement window to avoid setting off the alarm. They removed a single wax cylinder, an unlabeled one, a piece of someone's private history, forgotten in an attic and donated without context. He walked to the table where the torn label fragment lay beside Osric's handwriting sample, not matching, but placed together deliberately. This label was torn, Purbright said, because the object it described had been moved earlier. Moved before the first incident. That object was not valuable, not decorative. It was a plain wooden box containing 3 wax cylinders from the same estate. 2 labelled, 1 not. Corbally, pale as parchment, managed. But why reposition it at all? Purbright looked back toward Osric, who by now sat rigid, the torch he always carried, clutched in both hands. Because someone was searching, Purbright said softly. Searching for something hidden for decades, and they found it. Osric's breathing grew uneven. Dr. Harbury leaned forward. Mr. Bell, is this true? You were looking for something? Osric shook his head quickly. I didn't break in. No, Purbright said again, kindly. You didn't. But you knew who did. Osric stared at him as if a door he had tried very hard to keep shut had suddenly swung wide. Purbright continued, his tone never rising. The first incident wasn't yours, the second wasn't yours, but you recognized the test, the voice. You recognized it because you had heard it before. The room tightened around those words. A voice from your past, Purbright said, a voice you never expected to hear again. Osric's eyes shone, not with guilt, but with something closer to grief. He lowered the torch slowly, his hands trembling. My father, he whispered. A murmur rippled across the group. Purbright nodded, confirming what he had suspected since the moment Osric flinched at the fragment of label. Henley Bragg, he said. A modest, private man, your mother's brother. He raised you after her death. Osric lifted his head, surprise flickering across his features. How did you... You speak of him with the slight hesitation of emotional caution, Purbright said gently. A tone I have heard before. It is the sound of someone protecting something fragile. Osric stared down at his hands. I didn't know he made recordings. He wasn't the sort to record things. He recorded something, Purbright said. Something personal. Something intended either for someone he trusted or for no one at all. Osric swallowed hard. He always said some memories ought to stay quiet. And someone, Purbright said, feared that his memories might not stay so. The room shifted as understanding began to take shape. Purbright continued. Another person visited the museum before the first incident, someone who recognized the wooden box from the estate auction photographs, someone who knew that an unlabeled cylinder might contain something inconvenient, something revealing. Jonah whispered, the nephew. Purbright gave the faintest nod. The nephew, he echoed. A man who inherited the estate and promptly disposed of everything without examination. A man who might prefer certain family documents never reach public ears. Osric's voice trembled. He's ashamed of the past. Uncle Henley, he saw things differently. He believed people could be forgiven. And some, Purbright said, prefer secrets to forgiveness. He let the silence rest before finishing. The midnight voice was a test to see whether the recording's contents, whatever they were, would broadcast clearly. The intruder feared its revelation. On the second night, he took the cylinder to destroy it. Osric bowed his head. I should have told you I recognized the voice. It shook me. I thought I was imagining things. You weren't, Purbright said softly. It was your uncle.